Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. This is the only podcast where you get a dose of why we do what we do, combined with a spoonful of music.
A spoonful.
Well, it's not a lot. So speaking of this combination, Kurt, I have a question for you.
Okay, shoot.
So I'm wondering what you think makes Behavioral Grooves different from other podcasts about behavioral science.
Okay, so you offer me up a softball
question. It is a softball question.
All right, I like it. All right. So first, we combine great interviews with academics and practitioners along with that spoonful of music that you mentioned.
Love it.
All right. We're the only ones that combine music and that, right?
Yes.
So there you go. All right. Second, we include accidental behavioral scientists into the mix. Those are the people who are applying behavioral science into their work, in their lives, without even knowing that they're doing it.
Which is very cool.
Yeah. And third, we groove on each conversation. So we take the academic jargon and translate it into real life applications. We take the real life applications and highlight the research that goes behind it and looking at it. And so we have that grooving session at the end of each of our episodes.
Yeah. You know, the most compelling part for me
is the music.
No, it's the grooving session, actually.
What?
No, yeah. I know you'd think it would be the music, which I love. Oh my gosh, I totally love it. But our grooving sessions are really the most compelling and unique aspect of our podcast. And honestly, I have you to thank for that. You were the one that when we started this said, we need to do a grooving session at the end. So thank you.
Well, thanks for agreeing, I guess. Actually, it is my favorite part too. And I think, from me, it's the part where we get to really hone in on some of the learnings and hopefully express those in ways that the listeners can understand.
Yeah.
But it's also ways for us to really hone in and learn from those. So it's my favorite part of it as well. I don't know. Do you think that sometimes people may just fast forward through the episode to get to the grooving session? Well, let's hope not. Let's not answer that question.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So back to the show.
Okay.
All right. So I'm thinking that you might have brought up this podcast question because of our guest today.
Maybe. In this episode, we did speak with a couple of fellow podcasters in the behavioral science world. We talked to Zarak Kahn and Erik Johnson, and they run the Action Design Network podcast, which grew out of the Action Design Network Meetup that was originally founded in Washington, D.C.
Okay. So our listeners may think that it's strange that we're having a show with other podcasters who also run a podcast about behavioral science, but this isn't a competition.
Hell no.
It really is about growing this community of people who are interested in behavioral science. It's what we've talked about from the very beginning. We want to grow this community, and these guys do a great, great job with that. So Action Design Network has meetups in a number of cities throughout the world, and we'll link to those in the episode notes if you're interested in joining. And we do recommend that if you're in one of their cities, go to one of the Action Design Network meetups. They're fantastic. And we also talked about with Zarak and Erik about more than just the meetups. We discussed some of their observations that they've made as being hosts to a podcast on behavioral science. And we also talked about what they've learned from all of their guests that they've had on their show. And they have had some great guests.
Truly, they've had some real rock stars. And they've also had some cool insights to share. So at times, the conversation that you're going to listen to, it might meander a bit.
It might.
It's
podcasters talking to podcasters.
It is. Some insider conversations, some specific podcast details. And we apologize if it feels like it's getting long-winded, but that's just kind of what happens.
Yeah. And just a note for our listeners who are keeping track. This is our 96th episode, which means that we're fast approaching our 100th episode. Some of you may know that we've already recorded it in Philadelphia at a live event, but we're mentioning it for two reasons. First, we think you're going to love the discussion that we had with Annie Duke, Jeff Chrysler, and Michael Hallsworth at that 100th episode.
And second is that we want to express our gratitude to our sponsors of that 100th episode, Podbean and People Science. Podbean has been hosting our episodes from the very start. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast, we recommend that you launch it on Podbean. I mean, they've been nearly flawless in their experience from the very, very first episode.
And People Science is a great site to check out if you're interested in the behavioral sciences. The team at People Science curate a great content, even featuring you, our own beloved Tim Houlihan.
Amazing.
And we'll provide a link, and they also provide links to job postings and related events in the world of behavioral science. Check out the links in the show notes below to find out more information.
With that, we hope that you sit back with a fine listening beverage. We don't even need to pull from the...
Oh my God,
that was just terrible. Apparently no sound effects needed for that, since it was very real. But we hope you enjoy our conversation with Zarak Kahn and Erik Johnson. Zarak Kahn and Erik Johnson, welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. We're happy to be here.
It is so.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I'll let Erik speak for himself.
I am also happy, just to confirm.
Good. Well, we're going to start with the speed round. And since we have two guests today, let's go in, let's start in alphabetical order. So Erik, you'll answer first, and then Zarak.
Lucky me.
Yeah, right. Okay. So coffee or tea?
Coffee all the way.
All right, Zarak.
I'm a major coffee drinker and coffee snob. So yes, I love the coffee.
We're going to have to, we'll get there. Zarak, all right, bike or unicycle?
Ooh, unicycle.
Unicycle. You're like one of three people that have responded that way.
I love it.
I would have been surprised if Zarak answered any differently there. I would say. He's a unicycle kind of guy.
Okay, Erik, St. Louis or New York?
Oh, I got to go with New York because I actually lived there, and I've only been to St. Louis on a brief visit where I got a wonderful dinner and drinks with Zarak himself. But the too much. It's a lot. I put a lot of time into New York, so I got to pick that for now. Although I love the Midwest,
right
I'm a very strong Midwestern proponent.
All right, then. All right, Zarak, I'm asking you the same question. Go.
St. Louis, easy.
Way to go. I love it. I love the very first guest we've had that actually answered St. Louis. Of course, it's actually the first question
we've ever asked that had St. Louis in it.
It's my hometown. I'm just glad to hear that. Okay.
1 for 1.
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, welcome. We are super excited. We have been fans of you guys for a long time, and
same.
Wanted to talk with you. And one of the things that we have been fans of, and actually Tim and I actually talked to you, Zarak, when we were first starting Behavioral Grooves. We called you. Somebody recommended that we talk with you because you have this component that you've been working with called Action Design Network. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with Action Design Network, and I know Erik, you're part of that as well, help the listeners understand what Action Design Network is and what you guys are trying to do with that. Yeah,
sure. So I'll kick it off, and Erik, feel free to fill in any gaps because Erik, I think, has probably actually been involved even longer than I have. So Action Design Network is a nonprofit that was founded in DC in 2012 by Steve Wendell, who heads up behavioral science for Morningstar. And at the time, he was living in DC, and there was a group of folks there who wanted to connect and just talk and share stories and insights about behavioral science and applying it to product design and to public policy. And so it's grown kind of a lot since then. I started volunteering there in 2014. And since then we've expanded from, a couple hundred members in DC to now it's something like 15 or 16,000 members around about like 15 or 16 different cities. So we've been organized so far around like chapters in specific cities, and we're in a couple different countries now. And basically it's kind of like a little mini sort of informal TED Talk get together. So we'll bring researchers, practitioners, folks from product design or public policy or wherever to kind of talk about applying behavioral science to help people make better decisions. So that has been kind of like the core focus of the group for a long time, is almost as a convening body. And I would say that, we're trying to kind of evolve along with the needs of our members. So, when I first started, I remember my thought was like, this is really cool. I learned about this in school. I know I kind of want to do this somehow in my work, but I just want to stay connected, and like learn about what the kind of cutting edge stuff is that's going on. And this was a great venue for that. And over the years, we've seen more and more people kind of move beyond that to say, I actually want to do this as my job. Like, I want this to be like my full-time job, or I want to incorporate some significant component of it into what I already do. And even a group that's a little bit smaller, but certainly growing, that's like, this already is my job. How can I be even better at it? And so I think action design has kind of tried to evolve to meet, as I said, meet the needs of those different groups of people. And so, in recent years, we've launched our own podcast that Erik and I co-host as a way of kind of reaching folks that don't like live in an action design city. We've added like a jobs board in conjunction with peoplescience.com. And so that's to kind of help facilitate people, moving into a career in behavioral science, and a number of other initiatives kind of like that to sort of help meet the needs. So moving a little bit beyond just being a convening body and sort of sharing information to one that's kind of having a little bit more of a force in shaping the field of behavioral science, and kind of always with the sort of overarching mission of making it more accessible to people.
All right. Thanks. Erik, anything to add to that?
I think that covered it really well. I'll just say, I think a lot of what the group's aimed for is a little bit of how I got involved and how I got into behavioral science in general. It's sort of representative of what the group's sort of there for. Like way back, I'm actually trying to think now, we're talking about what year it was. I want to say it's probably like 2011, maybe. Early 2000s is kind of when I first discovered behavioral science and started getting really interested in it. And I lived in Washington, D.C. at the time and was able to connect with Steve Wendell, who was the founder of Action Design. And I started helping him kind of organize the meetups. And that was kind of my first introduction to outside of books, actually seeing, there's people that actually do this stuff and there's other people that are interested in this. And it really just kind of started as this kind of community and a way to connect with other people interested in it and to learn more about what people who are in the field are actually out there doing. So I think just over time, that simple mission or that simple goal is just sort of expanded into being in a lot of different cities and doing conferences, doing the podcast, and started connecting people through the jobs board and things like that. So it's always just kind of been about connecting people to behavioral science and, building more of a community around it. And, especially finding people who are actually out there doing it and, how they're going about doing so.
Well, we're going to want to make sure that we've got links to all the cities and how people can actually go and get involved in the meetups, because it's terrific, right, to have this community out there that is addressing the needs of people who are both interested and actually doing their jobs around behavioral science to expand this community. So we'll make sure that we get those in the show notes. But what led you from DC to the next city? What was it that somebody raised their hand and said, DC isn't enough, we got to have something else?
Oh, for action design? That's actually a good question. Zarak, what was the first chapter outside of DC? Was it New York?
You are the most qualified person to answer this question.
I actually couldn't remember if I was the first one. Okay, so I lived in DC. So I guess I generally couldn't remember if I was the first one or not. But yeah, I lived in DC at the time with that very first chapter and helped organize that. And then at the period of time, and actually really through people I met through action design, I ended up getting a role at Ideas 42, which is obviously a big behavioral economics shop. I know you've interviewed some people from there on the show. I ended up moving up there and working in their New York office. And I kind of decided I was going to bring action design with me. So I started a chapter up there and started kind of doing similar things. And obviously it was great because like New York has a thriving behavioral science community. It always has and still has quite a bit going on. So it just sort of happened by luck in a little bit of ways. I was like, why don't we start doing this up here? And then I don't really know how to expand it after that off the top of my head. But, once we got into one other city, we started to have more people reach out and go from there. So I'll let Zarak fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah, I can pick up the story from there. So what happened after that was we had our first national conference. So this was kind of my first contribution to the group after joining as an officer. Steve had asked me hey, can you explore doing a bigger conference for us to kind of add to the portfolio of things that we're doing or the ways that we're engaging with people and things that we're providing. And so we did, and it was successful. And there were a ton of folks that came up afterwards and were like, this is great. Like, how can we, be engaged with this? And we're like, oh, we've got a group here in DC. We've got one in New York. And you're like, okay, well, I don't live in either of those places. And at that point, Steve decided, so I think he was moving to Chicago from Morningstar right around then anyways. Maybe it was like a year later, but he sort of said, well, why don't we like change the structure of our group a little bit? And oh no, sorry, I led the DC chapter. I'm like getting ahead of myself here a little bit. Wow. And it's also something that like no one's interested in, probably like the internal mechanics.
We were truly walking down memory lane and trying to remember things that I haven't thought of in a while. Timeline gets fuzzy.
Steve asked me to lead the DC chapter, and then he stayed on as president, and he kind of took on this role of launching new cities. So I think that year we launched Chicago and San Francisco as like our next two
hotbeds for behavioral science, right?
Yeah.
I think what Sam Evans started Chicago, right?
Sam Evans started Chicago, and like so yeah. I mean, based on like the success of those cities, like a lot of those folks ended up becoming officers in action design as well. So I led the DC group for a year while Steve was president, and then I think when he moved to Chicago, he was like, "I'm just too busy." And I'm like holding things up. And so asked me to come on as president.
But you guys never came to Minneapolis. I'm disappointed. We would have joined you guys.
I know.
Most of you still can. There's still time.
Right.
I mean, honestly, like a lot of the new cities we weren't like, we need to be in Chicago. Let's find somebody in Chicago. It was always someone out there who we met through the conference or through the field or whatever that kind of volunteered to create a group.
Yeah.
So it's always been pretty organic growth, and that also has like drawbacks too. And that sometimes like someone starts a chapter in a city and then they get too busy with their job or they move or whatever. And then like it takes a little while to find somebody to like pick up the reins because it's a volunteer thing. Yeah. But it's always kind of grown organically, and that someone's been really excited about it and wanted to take the initiative to start a city. So there's no intentionality behind not strategically targeting Minneapolis.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're just staying away from Tim and me here. I got it. It's part of our group either,
That's behavioral grooves territory up there.
Yeah.
Well, let's say that somebody is listening to the podcast to this session, and they're like, "Wow, I'm curious about what an Action Design Network meetup is like." Can you just give us a quick overview of what an Action Design meetup is like?
Yeah, so
I'll give a little run through, and then I'll let Zarak fill in any details. So the kind of format that we've generally stuck to is kind of evolved a little bit over time, and some people have been creative and trying new things. Typically we do like roughly one meetup a month with a speaker. So we try to find a speaker that's in the local area or that might be happening to travel through that city and wants to give a talk. And it's got to be somebody who's in kind of applied behavioral science, who's either working within a company and like doing behavioral interventions, or they're an academic doing interesting studies, something like that. We have a speaker, and that's kind of the core of the program, but we always start with about an hour or so of kind of what we call just kind of networking and socializing. We have food, we have some drinks, people can kind of come and mingle. Then we usually do a presentation where kind of whoever the kind of subject matter expert of the month gives their talk. And then we go through that whole for 45 minutes to an hour, whatever that is. And then there's kind of some more kind of socializing and networking after that. That's really been the typical format that we've done. We've done some other things like, occasionally we'll just do like social events, just kind of like happy hours or something like that, where people from the group can come together. I know that like Robin Kriegelstein and the Austin group has been kind of creative and trying different sort of formats where he'll do more like workshops that he gives, and sometimes he'll bring in speakers, sometimes he'll just give stuff. So we've experimented with a little bit, but that's kind of been the typical format, just like some networking, like experienced speaker sharing some work that they've done with some Q&A, and just kind of a lot of socializing and the ability to meet other kind of behavioral practitioners or people who are just interested in it within your city.
Building that community and transferring of some hopefully knowledge around the area of expertise that you bring in.
Well,
Great.
and we're not alone, right? I mean, I think this is one of the really coolest parts of what you guys were up to in 2011, or when Steve, was saying this, is we're not alone. Like, there is this group of people out there who are B-side curious,
B-side curious,
but they're just interested. And as Zarak said, I think it's cool that there's this evolution that's gone into, wow, now people are actually doing this in their jobs. This is kind of a more day-to-day thing. I think that's really cool that the organization has continued to evolve as the industry has evolved.
All right, so we do have to ask though. So you had this whole action design network going on, all these different cities, and then you just come out and you like, what inspired a podcast? Because I know, Tim and I
origin tale,
own story behind our start, but what and around behavioral science, what inspired it? What was the impetus?
Well, I'll be curious to hear how similar our reasons for starting a podcast are.
I'm sure they are identical.
So I'll kind of tell it from my side, and then I know Erik had been thinking about a podcast for a while before we kind of joined forces on it. So I'll let Erik kind of give his story as well. But so I mentioned that we had this conference in DC. We had two more after that. So we had another one in DC and then one in Chicago, and they were all they were really fun, and they were, I would say, successful events. Like, they were financially successful. They accomplished our goal of bringing together people from all around the country, all around the world, for these really interesting talks in behavioral science. And at the time, I don't think that there were. I mean, now there's more conferences that are kind of like this, that are just focused on behavioral science, but the common refrain that we always heard from our speakers and presenters at the conference were, this is awesome. Normally I'm the behavioral person at blank conference. And here, it's all behavioral people. And it's not just whoa, did you know that brains are crazy? And here's a fun trick or whatever. It's you can really get into the weeds on some of the practical work. And so they were very successful, but they were, from my perspective, incredibly stressful. And so,
seconded, yeah.
It was a ton. What was that?
It was stressful to create these and
yes. That was great.
Exactly.
They were super fun and they were very accessible. But putting them together, putting together a big event like that is just a lot of work, especially when it's all volunteer time.
Oh yeah. So all action design folks are all volunteers. I mean, from the board and presidents, officers or whatever on down, it's all volunteer time, city organizers, and it takes a ton of time. And so a lot of times the people that you're asking to help put on a conference are already doing a ton of other action design stuff, as well as just their job or whatever their normal thing is that they do, So, not stressful from the sense of the event itself is great. And really the morning of, or even the evening before, it's the train has left the station and you can't really do anything else. You can only kind of enjoy it or, crash and burn. And luckily we never crashed or went off the rails with it. But so they were always very fun, but it took up a ton of volunteer time. And just, I remember thinking man, we're not really using this as a big fundraiser thing. We're not charging, I think our ticket prices were $400 or something like that, which this was, compared to say an Ideas 42, right? Which is I think $4,000, which there's a fundraiser for them as well. So I'm not trying to, one of the years we had announced it, they announced right around the same time and we weren't coordinated or whatever. And theirs was I think 2 weeks after ours, 2 weeks before, something like that. And we were oh no, do we need to change the date? And then we clicked through and saw oh no, there's this $4,000. We're fine. We're the Kmart of behavioral science conferences.
Different market.
DJ Maxx of behavioral science conferences.
So we think we're going a sufficiently different group of people. So ours was never really about fundraising that much. It was more okay, well, how do we kind of stay with the mission of reaching more people and making this accessible and kind of broadening it. And when I sat down and thought about how much time and effort went into this and the risk to the organization, and the trade-off, which was okay, well, what do we get? Well, we get 300 people, which is about 3 times the size of what a normal meetup would be for us. well, I was like, okay, it doesn't really seem like it's totally worth it. And right around then, I think Erik had reached out and said like, hey, like, I've been thinking about doing a podcast for a while. And Erik, I had already had like all this documentation. He's like, here's all the equipment we need. Here's whatever. And so we got together and started talking about like topics and speakers. And, when it really didn't take that long, to deliberate. We were like, well, we think we could reasonably expect to get almost anyone in behavioral science to talk with us over Skype for 30 minutes. But to get, some of these folks to fly out to a conference or fly in for a meetup or whatever, it's like, it's expensive, it's time consuming. And you're only reaching the people that are able to be in the room. So we thought, well, let's make sure this is fun. This has always kind of been a guiding principle of action design too. Like, every now and then, probably like once a year, we have like a meeting where we're like, should we like try to raise a bunch of money and hire staff and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, someone will inevitably be like, does that sound fun? I'm like, no, that does not sound fun. So we're like, podcast would be fun. It would be easy for us to do. We think we could get great content for it. And we think that it would fit with our mission of like sharing these stories and making this more accessible to a broader group of people. And we don't really like go too far in on like, we don't worry about sponsorship. We don't worry about like the analytics really. Like we look at it every now and then, and it's basically just kind of validated. Like, yeah, we regularly reach, 10x what we normally would from an event. And it's, accessible to people anywhere, and you don't have to be in a city or pay some money to get it or anything like that. So in our view, it's a success, and obviously it's very fun for us. We get to chat with folks like y'all.
Erik?
Yeah, and I'll add that that's kind of it. It's just like, it was an easy way to start. We wanted to like scale more, and like, how do we provide more interesting stuff beyond people that can make it to a meeting within a city that they're in? This is a relatively easy way to do it. And like I said, I had dabbled in podcasting a little bit. I had an idea for a long time of doing a behavioral science podcast, and I had actually started recording some things just on my own, but then other things kept coming up. Like at the time when I started, I was freelancing, and then I was just like, I got to focus on like work stuff. And then I moved to Chicago and started a job with Morningstar here. And I was like, I don't have time for it now. And like Zarak and I had started talking about it for a long time. It was actually kind of a funny behavioral lesson, I think, and that we were both interested in it, but I think I kept kind of pushing back a little bit because I always felt like I was too busy. I was like, I don't know if I can commit to it. I don't know if I have enough time. And I had in my head that like it had to be every week. I was like, always like, I don't have time. Like, I just don't know if I can commit to like recording a podcast every week. And Zarak's like, well, why don't we do like every month and just see how it goes? And I was like, I guess that makes sense. Like,
it was just like, okay, well, that's a suggestion I can live with.
Change the framing, and all of a sudden it becomes more reality. So
yeah, I mean, it's the equivalent of somebody who like, wants to start working out. It's like, I don't have time to work out 2 hours every day of the week. It's like, why don't you work out an hour, just 1 hour a week? It's like, oh yeah, that's a little bit easier. That's better than nothing. So props to Zarak for a nice behavioral intervention when my default was a little high there.
Well, Thank you, Zarak, for that.
Yes.
So,
you're welcome, world.
It mirrors Tim and me, I mean, to a certain degree, about finding those people that were coming into the local Minneapolis meetup and going, our network is much bigger than Minneapolis, and the people we want to talk to are much, are across the country or across the globe. And they're not going to fly into Minneapolis to do a meetup, for us, because we're not going to pay them, right? Because we're a nonprofit. Actually, we're a loss profit, I think, is how this works. But that whole component and getting that message out, I think, is a really important piece. And so we applaud you guys on doing that. So with the podcast, what has been most surprising for you from putting it on, or what you've learned, or just what has been surprising for you from what you thought it was going to be to what it actually is?
I think it's always surprising to me that anyone's interested in anything I have to say. I mean, I think this is maybe not a huge surprise, but it was like a welcome reinforcement, is that almost everyone that I have met in behavioral science is so open to talking and sharing. And, this has been true for action design from the beginning, where, we would reach out to speakers who, would normally, charge tens of thousands of dollars to give a talk. And, for a, 501c3 and we're like, look, we're all volunteers. None of us are making any money doing this. This is just for the good of the field. People were much more open to saying like, oh yeah, I'll donate my time. I'll, and so, that's held true for this as well. I mean, I don't think we've ever had anyone that we reach out to say like, no, I don't want to do this. And so, I mean, I think that it's been, that has been like a fun, again, not necessarily a surprise, but just like a nice thing to kind of like, know about the field, and then kind of like a different angle on it, I guess. But like, Erik and I had been looking for something to kind of do when we we enjoyed each other's company and we knew each other from action design. But I think by the time I was like kind of becoming more active in the group, Erik had moved up to New York. And so, we always like got along on, board calls and that sort of thing. And I think one of the, I don't know if this is like a sad lesson or not, but like, people get really busy. And so one of the ways that I've like, stayed connected sometimes with friends is like, let's find a project to do together, something that we're both interested in. And so, I like that it's been something that has kind of like given, Erik and I a chance to, stay connected and do fun stuff together.
Cool. Yeah. Erik, how about you?
Right back at you, buddy. So one thing I'll say, I don't think I'll ever get used to hearing my own voice on audio. It's just never gonna not be uncomfortable. I don't know if other podcasters feel the same, but it's always a little strange.
The voice in my head sounds much different than when I hear.
Yeah, way different. I guess one thing it's always still surprising when people, I mean, we're not some like huge show or anything, but like, we're fortunate we have like it's always surprising that people actually listen, I guess. Like, we've had people, I mean, Zarak had a really funny story of somebody in the real world. Like, weren't you like on a train or something and somebody?
No. So this was, I was in Philly a couple months ago, and I had drinks with a friend of mine from grad school, and he takes the train between Philly and DC every day. And he's like he does like system design stuff for a government agency. And so someone was sitting on the train next to him and was asking him about his work. And he was like, oh, I do like this design stuff. And she was like, oh, design, like, hey, you should check out this podcast. It's called Action Design Radio. And she like showed him, and it's like, oh, like hosts like Erik Johnson and Zarak Kahn. And he's like, oh yeah, like I went to grad school with that guy. It's like, you didn't even say we were friends. You just said that. You're like, well, I know that guy from school. We've had a couple things like that where people come up at conferences or whatever, and they're like, hey, like, we love to listen to podcasts. And I like emailed Erik and our producer, Zach Simon, like all caps. I was like, someone listens to us. The first time somebody came up to me and said that, I was like, I did not play it cool at all. It's like, really? Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, it's always like funny and surprising. I think part of it because it feels, like I said, it feels fun to us. Like one of the things that when we started is like we wanted it, and I think this is how I get the impression is how you guys do your show too. But like we want it to be like if you were listening to like friends having a conversation over the phone or over coffee or whatever. I think like it really does feel like that. Some of the people we interview we know pretty well. Some people we don't know super well, but they're all very easy to talk to. It's very easy to have conversations with people in this field. And I think this is something through action design, through everything, is that the behavioral science field is just so cool, and that it's still not that big, and everyone's really helpful and really friendly. And getting people to record these episodes and just having these conversations are always just really fun and enjoyable. And I almost forget it's something we're putting out into the world. It's like, oh, this is a fun conversation we just had, but then other people are coming in on that too. So that's really cool. I think, if there's only one other thing, it's just like audio challenges. We got started a little late today because of those. At like our very first episode, we tried to record. We did record. We'll never see the light of day because we messed up the audio. And it's just there's all these like little things that you kind of learn over time that it's a little more complicated than just like jumping on a video call with people.
Yeah, don't try a new system when you're interviewing a new famous guests.
Like a Nobel laureate.
All of our most like every time we've tried a new system, it's always like, why didn't we not just try this with ourselves before we lose an entire interview, which was happened to us at least twice.
Yeah, there was our first one. There was another one with a pretty prominent academic that will also never see the light of day because we tried using a new recording system and it didn't work.
Yeah, similar. We had Bob Cialdini, who we had worked for months to get on and schedule because he's so busy and everything. And we had a great interview with him. And then there was no file.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's so painful.
Luckily, we were able to retrieve it, but there was a 18-hour window of just crap.
So those are the surprising things. What are the top two things? Since we're both in this part of the business, the industry of podcasting and interviewing people, the learning is tremendous. So what do you think, Erik, are the top two things that you've learned that were maybe not so evident to you, even though you've been in the field, you've studied, you're deep into the application of behavioral science all the time. But through the interviews, what have you learned? What has come up?
Oh man, you mean like about behavioral science in general, or just like about having these kind of conversations, or
more about like growing up?
Anything. That's a really good question. I think we learn something from every guest, and I always find it interesting. I think it's just more just how many different angles there are to this kind of stuff. And that we talk to people in so many different contexts that have, I'd say there's kind of two things. Like one is just how we all face the same problems in a lot of ways. Like, when I've been working on applied behavioral science projects, sometimes it's very easy to feel, especially because it is a niche field, like you're the only one that's dealing with this issue. And, like, why am I so bad at this or something like that? And then you have all these conversations, you realize like everybody kind of runs into the same sort of stuff in different forms, whether it's getting buy-in to do it, having people properly execute a behavioral intervention, whatever that is. A lot of us have the same challenges, which is kind of reassuring. And is really helpful to talk through in the show and provide those kind of solutions with other people. And otherwise, I'd say it's just like, everybody has different experiences, different contexts they're working in. It's always interesting and exciting to see how different things work in different ways in different contexts, whether it's a type of intervention using a heuristic or whatever that is, might work differently in one context than the other. What someone finds is effective in one industry can be different in another. It's just kind of a funny thing of just like how much we're all the same in some ways, or how we run into the same things, but also how much the work, how like really diverse the work is, and how it's kind of a never ending journey of finding all these different interesting insights into people.
Yeah, that contradiction of, a lot of it is the same, but every situation is unique in its own manner.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
Find that out.
Yeah.
Zarak, what about you?
Yeah, I would say I'm always surprised by, or, I'm interested in learning people's entry into behavioral science, like where they started. And it's, I think, heartening to kind of see like it sort of changes over time, right? Like the folks who've been doing it for a while, is particularly on like the non-academic side, have like crazy backstories. Like none of it's not, and now it's a little bit more like, oh, I went to school for it, or I studied this, and then I did, a internship here, and then, whatever. So it's a more like kind of defined career path, which I think is good for the field. But like the people who kind of like stumbled into it they just always have really interesting backstories. I think there is the common theme across all those folks is curiosity. Everyone's always just very curious about, oh, why does this happen? And why do people do this way? The other thing that I was thinking of, I forgot the other thing I was thinking of. It'll come back to me later, maybe.
Walk down memory lane a little bit.
Yeah.
So actually, I have a question. You guys have gotten some really great guests on, right? And we listened to them. You got some great guests, but who is that dream guest that you have not had on yet that you would just be, this is the person, this is the one that, and I just want to be just making sure that everything is on our A game.
Are you asking because you think that this person might be listening to our podcast, and so
exactly.
that instantly ring right up and say, oh my gosh, we should be on Action Design Network?
And then we can all do a joint episode with that one person. Yeah.
We've been trying to nail down the behavioral grooves guys for a while. I don't know if you have an in with them.
We are living that dream right now, actually.
I heard they were kind of jerks. You don't really
difficult to work with. They only want green M&Ms in their green room. I don't know. That's a good question. That's a fun question. I think when you get to like folks that are kind of like considered like founders of the field, I would just feel like way more pressure. Partly because, I guess there's a couple of reasons. One is like, as Erik said, a lot of the folks that we have had on are people that we either are essentially friends with or, at least have met a couple times in some setting and have some relationship with. And I think those tend to go, it's almost like the better we know someone, the better the conversation is, like the more natural it feels. Otherwise, it takes a few minutes to kind of like get into that. The other is like, typically those folks are, you really only have one shot. As we said, we've lost audio on some like really prominent folks who are like, well, that's just, it's never going to happen again, or it's going to take a year or two. And then, I think it's just like, I would be thinking more about like, I usually don't think that much about how I sound, like the questions that I'm like, oh, does this question make me sound like I know what I'm talking about? I'm just like, oh, that's kind of interesting to me. I think I would feel more just sort of like almost, I don't know, self-image, like reputational risk or something. I'm like, am I going to look like an idiot in front of Daniel Kahneman or something like that?
So you haven't said a name yet. Yeah.
Who's on your list?
Danny Kahneman on? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, so I think a fun one that would not feel as intimidating would be like Dan Ariely. I think that would be a lot of fun. But yeah, I mean, I think the other folks that kind of come to mind would be, Danny Kahneman. That would be incredible. I mean, probably anyone that's won a Nobel Prize,
Maybe Richard.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
All
right. Yeah, I think like I would say, like a Kahneman or Thaler, or even like Sunstein. Like I feel those people that are sort of like the ones that really got this whole thing going. And to be honest, having them on the show, I would just love to talk with them about less even the specifics of behavior science and more about the journey and how they've observed, they've all written books kind of about the founding of it and how they kind of get into it. So some of that's there, but I'd love to talk to them more about how like they've observed it grow outside of their work, and what changes they've seen. And like, since, since Kahneman's original research came out, like, how has he seen that grow? How has he seen that applied? Since Nudge came out, like, what's that journey been like, seeing it grow? Where's it going? Things like that. Those would probably be kind of like the dream conversations, I think.
Yeah. So that leads me into the very next question. So thank you for that. So we're going to ask.
I am here to help. Yeah.
You guys are, you're in the field, you're working it, you're doing the podcast, talking to all these great guys. Where do you see? So like you were saying, like, well, you'd like to ask Danny about, how it's moved and transferred, but what about you guys? Where do you see it moving to? What are the areas that you see behavioral science really having an impact moving into the future, either for work or just in general?
I can take a sort of first swing at that. So, I mean, I think a overarching kind of like broad statement is just like, it's just growing a lot, right? So there are more people that are interested in it. There are more people who kind of know what it is. And you see that reflected in both the types of like jobs and positions that are available. So there are more jobs that are specifically like, we're looking for a behavioral scientist or a behavioral designer, something like that, right? Something where they're using like applied psychology or some kind of behavioral science. You also see more jobs where they are saying, like, hey, I want a product manager, or I want a UX person, or I want a policy analyst, but I want them to have had experience or exposure to behavioral science. So, not only just pure, I'm a behavioral scientist, but also like, oh, I'm a policy analyst, but I know behavioral science, right? So, I see it kind of growing in that sense on like the career side, and then also on the training side, right? So there are more, and this is actually, we just had a sort of series of podcasts on this topic of like training in behavioral science, right? So it's not just like come in for a workshop, although those can be great, but now there's like, master's programs in behavioral science. There are sort of extended boot camps in behavioral science. There are a number of ways that you can kind of learn more about behavioral science and then take it back to your current job, or, kind of pivot your career into something that's more focused solely on behavioral science. And so, I think, for us and for Action Design, that's something that we've kind of been trying to help facilitate as well. I mentioned the jobs board earlier that we launched in partnership with People Science as one kind of sort of first step towards that, of like kind of a place that people can go to look for positions in behavioral science, because they're not always easy to find. And it's also not always easy to find people for those jobs when you're hiring for it. So, that's something that I think we're kind of like interested in. And certainly I'm interested in kind of building out that next evolution of just the field itself, on like the applied side. So, we've talked about things like, and Erik has written like a great article, almost like a how-to guide for behavioral scientists on how to hire a behavioral science person. So we've thought about things like putting out, guidance or tips for like HR functions of like this, if you're putting out like a job description, and we've started doing this at Maritz, like here are things that you can incorporate into almost any role to say like, behavioral science, background or behavioral science, whatever. And making it kind of like appropriate for the type of work the person will be doing. So I think a lot, when this first started, a lot of organizations just kind of almost as like a sort of for the signaling value would just say like, you need to have a PhD in behavioral science or a PhD in whatever. And in some cases that is actually what they needed. And in a lot of cases, maybe most cases, they just needed somebody who knew how to run experiments.
Yeah.
And so more and more often you have folks who have that background, but might not have a PhD. And so you kind of see things start to shift where, job descriptions are changing and the training that people receive is changing as well. So people get that kind of training earlier on in, even in an undergraduate program or certainly in a master's program. So, we've talked about doing things on like the kind of hiring side and then also on like the kind of training side. So, I guess I like officially signed my paperwork for this last week, so I can announce it on your podcast. But I'll be teaching a course at Penn in their Master's in Behavioral Science and Decision Science program next semester on like behavioral science consulting. So, applying the stuff that they're learning to problems and challenges that organizations are having related to behavioral science. And so, we've been always looking for ways of like, how do we contribute to the further growth of the field and the expansion and making it more accessible to people, both in kind of preparing them. So we started with like sort of exposure to behavioral science stuff and now moving more towards training. And I think we'll also start to see kind of more resources. And I don't know if it'll take the form of like an affinity group or if it's something that Action Design will do, but more resources for that kind of like group of folks that are already sort of practitioners of behavioral science who are facing problems like Erik mentioned, where it's not necessarily that you don't know behavioral science, it's that you don't know how to get support internally in your organization for, running an experiment, or how do you build out a behavioral science team, or those types of things that are, they're certainly not like 101 behavioral science intro kind of talks. It's more like sort of how do we organize this and how do we kind of, operationalize it as the field expands, and it's not just you're the one behavioral scientist at a 20,000 person organization. You actually like have a team, and that requires a different skill set.
Erik, how about you?
Like three things come to mind. I think one, I think just piggybacking on what Zarak said, I think just making this an easier part of what people do will be really the ultimate goal, and that this isn't something where you have a team, you have a specific behavioral scientist or team of behavioral scientists in your company. It's just something that everyone kind of knows and knows how to apply within their role. Like a lot of when I talk to people, I talk to people pretty often who are interested in the field and they're trying to figure out, how should I go into this? How should I do it? And in general, unless you really want to like go down more the academic route and spend a lot of time in school, I think for most people, it's better to decide the thing you like doing that's more of a traditional job and make behavioral science a part of that and make that your kind of differentiator or what makes you really good at that, whether that's being a UX designer or a marketer or a manager or what have you. So I think like making it easier for people to do that and take behavioral science and apply it to a job that already exists will really be sort of the end goal of what really makes this stuff have the biggest impact. So number 2 is I think kind of the thing that I'm really interested in lately, and I think is starting to get some momentum in the field is focusing a little more on like bigger strategic decision making. I think we kind of forget sometimes that behavioral science is really about making decisions. And I think we've gotten a little too technical in some ways in how we look at that. A lot of what people associate, or a lot of people in the field associate with doing behavioral science is like running an experiment. And I love experiments. Like my job in the last few years was to run a lot of experiments. I've also seen there's kind of a lot of challenges and limitations to that approach of saying the way that we do behavioral science is by running experiments. That is ideal, but it's just sort of antithetical to how people want to think. For whatever reason, people are sort of averse to experimentation. It can be very challenging in real world environments to run experiments the way we want to. I think there's still a lot of opportunity to look at more of the choice architecture of organizations or systems, whatever that is, and just think beyond just trying to measure one intervention in one isolated point of that organization, that system. How are people processing information? How are they making decisions based on information in all of those points? So I don't know how clear there's still, the last 2 are a little bit of half-baked ideas still. But I think focusing more on that broader decision-making and like within a big organization, within whatever system we're in, how do we optimize the way that people can process and use information to make decisions? I think the last thing, and something that I've been kind of thinking about more is I think there's really just a broader lens that you kind of view the world in when you understand this stuff, or when you start to learn it. And once you kind of understand the way that people think in these sort of, like we call irrational ways, or the way that people might interpret and make decisions emotionally rather than based on, kind of factual information. I think that it'd be helpful to kind of think of how can we help people see things in that way. Like for me, the more and more I learn about this stuff, and it's really a rabbit hole that never ends to see how people make decisions, how they choose to do what they do. The more I kind of learn about this stuff, the more the world just kind of looks different in a lot of ways, and the more it makes sense in a lot of ways. And I think it'd be helpful to kind of help people start seeing that lens. Like, for me, like, for example, if I see somebody that has an opinion on some issue that's a lot different than mine, I have a little bit more empathy because I see like, well, this is the background they're from. This is their incentives in this moment. This is why they kind of feel that way. They don't really it's not that they don't care about a particular thing I care about. They're just not aware of it yet. We're thinking like that could be a lot of those things result in bigger disagreements or something in the real world. I don't know if this makes a ton of sense. This is still a new idea I'm trying to flesh out, but I just think there is a lot of, when you start to learn this stuff and you see like the way people tend to make decisions, and the way that kind of our minds work within the real world, you kind of view things differently. I think you just tend to have more empathy for other people. And I think you can just be a lot more effective in actually driving to get things done that you want to get done, driving causes that you believe in, things like that. So I think in kind of helping understand like this kind of broader lens of this is what kind of the world works from this psychological perspective, is something that we can all work towards.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight.
Z, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I realized halfway into my sentence that I'm not the interviewer here, but I was going to ask Erik a question about his thought, which was just, do you think that has to do with behavioral science training specifically, or do you think that is just that like you're more used to kind of doing like metacognition, and you're thinking about why you think these things, and so you're just kind of taking a beat and like asking yourself like, oh, I wonder why this person is thinking that thing? Or do you think that there's actually something specific to behavioral science that makes you, that gives you more pause there and like time to kind of empathize?
It probably loops back to what we were talking about, was kind of the training. Like, how do we make this accessible for more people so that whether they want to, people that don't want to be a behavioral scientist can still do behavioral science and still understand it. So that's probably still like the, and I guess now that I think about it, there's sort of two sides of that. There's sort of the practical side of like, someone is going to be in this type of career. Here are the things that are relevant to them. The concepts and especially the tools that help them do their job better. But then maybe beyond that, there's sort of like, here's the broader things about sort of human nature, human decision making, that you should understand that might help you understand how to kind of navigate the world a little bit differently and how to solve problems differently and empathize with people differently, and that kind of thing. So I don't know, does that make sense as far as an answer?
It does.
Yeah.
Enough. Okay.
Thanks for lightening our load there, Zarak.
Yeah, I won't do that again. Sorry.
That's okay.
Thanks, man.
So I can see in Tim's eyes that it is the time of our interview where he wants to ask you guys a specific question, or maybe a general question.
No, it's just general. You know, we always end our conversations with guests to talk about music. And
love it.
Yeah. So, Z, you and I have talked about music in the past. Erik, you and I have not. So I'd actually like to start with you. What's on your playlist right now?
What's on my playlist right now? Ooh, man, I love making playlists. And I just have a lot of different ones that I kind of regularly add on to.
By Zarak on how to do playlists, because he is like Captain Playlist.
Is he? We might have a competition. You know what we need to do?
I follow a lot of Erik's playlists, actually. So I don't know if I would win that competition. We're pretty cooperative.
This is giving me a great idea, and that we need like a behavioral science radio station.
Action Design Radio, isn't that what you guys do?
Yeah, but like music focused. Maybe let's do a big like music festival where we all have a DJ set where we play our music. I don't know.
Awesome.
Behavioral science, Behavioral Fest 2020. It's gonna be epic.
Right before Coachella. There you go.
There we go. Yeah. But yeah, so I make a lot of playlists. Like, I'm pretty into a lot of different genres of music. I'd say music's something I'm pretty into. I've never really played. I've just always really been into listening to a lot of different music. And I think music is something that's sort of a big part of everyone's lives. Like funnily enough, like last night, I noticed that like best of the decade lists are starting to come out. And for one, it really hadn't hit me that a decade is ending until I saw that. Yeah. But then I was kind of going through this list, and like, I'd say, you know, I don't know, like the beginning of the decade, I was sort of my early 20s. And I think it was kind of like this is probably the most like I'll be into new music in this last decade. So it was really cool going through that, like, as memory lane of like, oh, wow, I forgot about this album, or like, I remember this from my time being here, and that kind of thing. So for me, music's a very like contextual thing, and I'm into a lot of different stuff. As far as this is my playlist, I would say, I'm opening my Spotify right now to even say like, so like what I usually do is I have like a rock playlist. Like, these are all the rock songs that I like, and I just add new songs to that. I have like an electronic music playlist I like to like work out to, or just add stuff to that. I have like a hip hop playlist. I just add things to that. So I don't know, I'm usually adding really random stuff there. I'd say like maybe I can just say some like albums or bands I'm listening to recently.
Sure.
From
your rock playlist first, and then we'll get to EDM. But
okay. Yeah, on the rock side, recently I started listening to this band called Idols, like IDLES.
Okay.
They're like a UK pretty like hard rock band, but they're really, really good. Oh man, I'm trying to think. This is one of those questions that just like stumps me. There's too many like answers to give. I don't know, a few albums I've liked a lot this year, like Vampire Weekend's new album. I like Local Natives a lot. I thought Lana Del Rey's new one was really good. All those are Carly Rae Jepsen has had a great pop album this year. I enjoyed that one. Yeah, no, it's a little sample. I'm kind of all over the place, but it sort of goes all over a little bit.
Excellent.
All right, Zarak, how about you?
Yeah, I'll go through a couple like songs that's a little bit more specific, and then there's some people that are just kind of always on my like heavy rotation. So the way that I have I listen to almost all my music on Spotify as well, and I have it set up where I have a playlist of like essentially like heavy rotation, what I'm listening to right now, and that just stays on there until I sense that I'm skipping it a lot. And once I start to skip it a lot, then I move it to I just have it called like my B-sides like playlist, but it's basically like anything that used to be on heavy rotation, even if it was only there for a day, gets moved to B-sides. And then I will have, and so that's like, 5 days long or whatever at this point, because I've been doing this, had this system for several years at this point. So the things that are on my like kind of heavy rotation now that I'm listening to a lot, there's this song that has been there for several months now.
Ooh.
It's by a band called Oak, W-Y-E, Oak. The louder I call, the faster it runs. The album was the same name. And there's a line in there that I really love, and I feel like it's great for behavioral science too. I search for patterns since that isn't there. And I kept thinking about that and have been like, I had been looking for like a project to do with in some kind of like art gallery or museum. And I talked with a couple of behavioral science people that had been kind of interested in the same type of thing. And so I had this like idea for like an installation at a gallery where you have things that are essentially kind of nonsensical patterns, but you tell people like there's a pattern here. Well, it would be a number of different interventions, right? But one would be like people look at it and then you like ask them to write down what they see as the pattern. One where you could sort of like say like there is a pattern here. Let us know once you find it. And you could even have, your Confederates or whatever folks in there who like are like, oh, I see it, and like go over and like write it down on something. It'd just be interesting to see like what people kind of come up with, because we're such like pattern seeking creatures.
We have totally crossed into Nerdville here when we went so easily into a behavioral science experiment.
Yeah, well, I've been taking active steps towards this. So I just joined here in St. Louis. We have a contemporary art museum, and I just joined their junior board, and so I'm like working my way slowly towards some kind of experiment in the museum or gallery.
Cool.
What the other ones?
Yeah. What else?
Yeah, the other ones that I listened to. So Sylvanesso is a favorite band of mine from Durham, North Carolina. And I'm going to go see them in concert for my birthday next month. So I've been listening to them. Johnny Flynn, a song Raising the Dead from his album Cillian, that my sister sent me because she thought it reminded her of our grandfather. So I've been listening to that one a lot. And then some things that are just kind of, what's that?
He's not the former Minnesota Timberwolves player, is he? Johnny Flynn, who?
Yeah, former Minnesota Timberwolves player who then became an Irish folk singer. Or I guess maybe he's English, but yeah. No, I think he's probably a different person.
It's very different. Yeah.
The other things that are kind of always on my heavy rotation are Sharon Van Etten. Kind of pretty much always have at least one song of hers on a playlist. Gillian Welch.
Oh, wow.
And let's see. I guess the other one that I would put on there is M. Ward. I feel like I'm always kind of listening to M. Ward. Even though I don't think he's done anything super recently.
Okay. That's a pretty diverse mix. That's very cool. Yeah, I dig.
Sounds like Zarak prepared his answer a little bit. I knew the music question was coming, and I was like, "Oh, that'll be easy to just talk on." And then, of course, like it's his choice paralysis. I was like,
oh my gosh,
it's too much to talk.
Well, I don't normally have a song that I felt like was so aligned with behavioral science, but in that Oak song that's been like stuck in my head for like months, and I was like, all right, if I ever get invited to behavioral grooves, I'll have a song to talk about.
I saw Oak open for the National like years ago.
Oh wow!
Oh, awesome!
I like the National.
Yeah, National is one of my favorites.
Well, gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for being on. This has been fantastic, and we hope to to talk with you guys more. This is great, and we love what you're doing out there.
Yeah.
And keep it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Likewise, thanks for having us.
Thank you guys. This is super fun. Could keep going for hours, I'm sure.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion, and whatever else comes into our podcast minds.
I'm so glad that you went there. That's because that's what this was about, podcasting to a large degree.
It was.
Podcaster on podcaster.
Podcaster on podcaster, which got a little weird at some points, but that's all right. We have those conversations.
I liked it. It was a fun conversation. These guys are sharp. They care a great deal about what's going on in the behavioral science world.
Well, and I have to give a big shout out to Zarak, because when we started Behavioral Grooves, the Meetup, we reached out to him. We didn't really know him at all. And we reached out to him because of his work with Action Design, and we knew that he had been former president, or somehow we got his name. And
he might have even been president at the time.
And he was so gracious with his time and his insights, and helped us formulate the Meetup and how it was run and operated. And then to find out, that, hey, he's doing a podcast too, and we're doing a podcast. It was it's wow.
Yeah, it's pretty great, actually.
So what did you take away from our conversation?
So there were a couple of really big things. The first thing was just talking about what they observe and what they're coming away with, what Erik and Zarak are learning through their interviews.
Yeah.
And I loved that because that resonated with me in the kinds of things that we get to learn in the interviews that we have.
We learn?
I learn. You learn. Of course you learn.
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do. But Erik's second comment about how important context is, when he started, right? This is like, that was just so cool.
I looked at you when he said that. I don't know if you noticed that, but I was like, this is right up Tim's alley. Context matters.
So you're not surprised that I bring that up as one of the most important things that we talked about.
No, it was right on. It was right on key. And thinking about it, if I had to go back and look at lessons learned from our almost 100 episodes, context is a key piece of that.
It really is.
It is one thing that keeps coming up over and over and over, how important our decisions are, that our decisions are based a lot on the context of that they're being made in, outside of what we would think rationally we should be doing, right? It's so impactful, the context, whether that be social, whether it be emotional, whether it be environmental.
It is fascinating, isn't it, that the more we dig into this, and as much work as you and I have done researching behavioral experiences up to now, the podcast and our guests have illuminated the emphasis of two things for me: context matters and the ethics.
Yeah.
These are such powerful tools that when you use them in an intervention, you can really wreak havoc in the world.
You can, or you can do a lot of good. And that kind of leads to where we might want to go, right? Right. So one of the things that I liked about this interview was we talked about where behavioral science is going.
That was a great question. It was a great question. It was really,
I think you wrote it. So
well, you asked it though.
I just read it. So thank you for writing such a insightful and wonderful question.
No, thank you. I agree, Kurt. That was pretty terrific. This whole idea of integrating behavioral science into the world that we live in, on a more, just a broad scale basis.
Right. It's integrating it, but I think Z talked about having growing the number of jobs growing in behavioral science.
Yeah.
Or not maybe having a specific behavioral science in the title, but that behavioral science is now a requisite for that job. Marketing, human resources, a number of those facets that wow, you have to have a grounding in behavioral science in order to be a successful candidate for that job, or to really operate in that job, regardless of whether you're a behavioral scientist in title and that is your job, using behavioral science in these other aspects. And I think that's true. I think that is really growing, and I'm hopeful.
Well, the world of advertising certainly has informed us that better headlines get better results. And so I just think about how if you're writing, if you're doing a proposal or you're making a presentation, the kinds of words that you use on the screen or on that paper make a difference.
They do.
And I think advertising has helped illuminate that as an industry. So maybe behavioral sciences could help influence us to say, yes, those words matter, and there's a psychological impact component that could impact us from a behavioral perspective.
Well, there's a scientific way of looking at those words, right? It's not just saying, I like how these words sound. You might have the most clever, witty, tagline or words on a page, but if they're not resonating with the context, coming back to context that you are trying to convey that information in, they may backfire on you. And so it's understanding, do we use a loss perspective here or do we use a gain perspective? Do we use emotionally charged words because we want to evoke a reaction out of people, or do we go with a more staid, rational piece because we're trying to get them to switch to system 2 thinking? And so how do we do that? So it's that scientific aspect that comes into this, that if we can do this, which leads me to the next part that I'm, and we didn't talk about this, but it was one of the aspects that I really thought about, is this behavioral science is being integrated into the larger context within society. And so it's what we're trying to do. We're trying to grow this community of people who are interested in behavioral science.
Yeah, we hear newscasters using terms like biases and mental shortcuts in the way that they're describing the way things get framed.
And it's expanding, obviously, business, but also in government and then other things. But I think that behavioral science lens that is being out there in the world creates a different way of viewing and living in the world. And I think that's a positive. I think it can be a positive.
Yes.
Because if we take this viewpoint of we have a better understanding of why we do what we do, that can only be helpful in our day-to-day interactions, whether it be at work, whether it be with the strangers driving a car, as you were talking about your wife and the stories you were saying about how she's more relaxed now because she understands, those people in the other cars aren't being malicious towards me because they cut me off. Or
they might just be bad drivers. Or they might be having a bad day. But there's a context outside of herself that she's more aware of today than she was 5 years ago.
Well, and having that spotlight, understanding the spotlight effect, right? right? Which is that aspect that, wow, the spotlight is on me and everybody's looking at me. When in reality, no, they're not. Everybody has their own spotlight and they're thinking about themselves and
all the time.
They're not looking at your zipper down. They're wondering if my zipper, is my own zipper down, right?
Is that the only example that came to mind for you?
It was the one that came to my mind right away. You come up with a better example yourself, Mr. Righteous. I'm talking about changing the world, and you go.
Well, you're the one that brought up zippers, so. No, but it is that. It is, in some ways, it's that simple, right? In some ways, it is that simple, but it's not easy necessarily to execute on.
I love that. It's simple, but not easy, right?
Yeah.
The concepts that we talk about here, and we see this all the time with the accidental behavioral scientists that we do, oftentimes, while they seem unrational or irrational, we have figured them out for the most part as humans because of the way we just operate within the world oftentimes. Mm-hmm. And they're not rocket science. I mean, we are not creating this spaceship that has to fly to Mars or wherever it is.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, well, particularly with us, we wouldn't get, anyway.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that while the concepts are relatively simple, and maybe they're not. Maybe we're oversimplifying it ourselves. But the application of those principles is definitely not easy, and it is hard because we'll just go with loss aversion, right? My favorite go-to thing, and loss aversion works in many instances, but we shouldn't use it in all instances because it can have other, corollary impacts on how people are viewing things. It could backfire in certain instances. It could, it may work, but there may be a better way of looking at something in order to drive, that behavior that you're trying to drive. So we have to understand whatever that context is that we're placing it in, and all of the potential impacts that our decisions are doing, and the way that we're looking at the world. So,
absolutely. Would you mind if I switched over to a musical question for you?
Go for it.
So I really like the way Zarak and Erik are super intense about their playlists. They've got a workout playlist and a get ready playlist and swim in the pool playlist. I don't know, lots and lots of different playlists. Okay, maybe not the swim in the pool thing. But I wanted to know if you organize playlists for specific occasions. Do you use Spotify? Do you actually create playlists on Spotify?
So I don't use Spotify. I use Pandora.
Okay.
Plug up for them. If you guys want to sponsor us, please go.
Please
do that. I don't. I don't have specific playlists for specific activities or different things. It's based upon my mood at the time, and then my playlists themselves are mostly stations. So in Pandora, you set up a station, which
because that's a way of curating the general sound.
It's the general sound, not the specific songs. And so when I'm the only one that I have that is more specific is the rare times when I am like cooking in the kitchen. I will play
the French music.
Yeah, I will play French cooking music. And there is a Pandora station that is French cooking music, which is a wide variety of everything from, yes, there are some French songs, but there's also some like 70s pop songs mixed in there. I don't know why, but it's a nice little mix. So that's the only one that I use more consistently than others. Otherwise, it is just depending upon my emotional state.
Okay, so what about in iTunes? Have you created? We've talked about mixtapes. You've created mixtapes.
I used to.
Past. Yeah,
I used to. I don't anymore. And even on iTunes, when iTunes first came out, and I had the iPad, iPod, not the iPad. I would go in there and make these playlists, and the playlists had weird names like smooth and energy and different things that were, and my wife would look at me going, what the hell is this? Like, oh, it's the concept that I'm trying to go
the
for.
vibe.
The vibe. And I have not done that in years. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You've gotten away from it.
I've gotten away from it.
Because of stations, do you think?
I think so, because I think the stations achieve pretty much that same piece.
Yeah.
With much less work on my part.
Yeah, interesting.
And I'm just probably older and less, into it from that perspective of curating which exact songs.
Well, it's a lot less friction to just dial up a station and just let somebody else curate the music for you. Let the algorithms in Spotify create it for you, right? I mean, that's...
Or Pandora, who's going to be our new sponsor here at the end of this. What about you? You obviously asked this question for a reason. Do you
I was curious.
Curate your own playlists, and do you have specific ones for specific times of your life?
Yeah, I do. I do. And they're still in iTunes. So I maybe I'm a bit old school in that way. And I'm also not, I don't support Spotify because I think that they do a terrible job of supporting artists. I think that their artist share is very low. Pandora's better, by the way.
Which is going to be our new sponsor. So of course they're better.
Yeah, but I like creating those playlists. I like having them, and I like having them on my phone. I like having them readily available.
So give us for example, what do you have?
So it's a mix of. So I like your vibe thing. Some are just this is kind of the vibe. Then there's also some that are specifics, like this is dinner music. I've got a couple of dinner playlists, and then I've got some. So they're more experiential. I should create a cooking one, though. I think that's a great idea. Actually,
you could just go to Pandora and do the French cooking.
and some are artist specific. I like the idea of listening to one artist, throughout, for an hour or so, and just hearing a mix of their tunes and charting, kind of mentally and emotionally charting their progress as songwriters and performers.
That's interesting
across their career.
Because when I made my playlists and did that, I would often do that. I would put sometimes on some of them, it's like the same song. So for instance, Dan Wilson, right?
Yeah.
He wrote a couple different songs for the Dixie Chicks that he then did himself. And so I would create a playlist that had the exact same song back to back that the Dixie Chicks sang, and then
say that 3 times.
Yeah,
fast.
and then Dan Wilson sang, and seeing again the nuances between those two. And
That's
so
cool.
I would do that, and I would do early ministry, late ministry after many drugs, early ministry when there's few drugs, late ministry when there's many drugs.
I think that's cool, though. That's kind of charting these nuances and differences rather than just taking anything that comes randomly. But that's also when I'm listening. That's actually listening to music that I want to hear that. Not so much when music is just playing in the background.
Right.
That's
Very
different.
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So listeners, thanks for listening. That's what you guys do.
Thanks for putting up with podcasters talking to other podcasters and going off on really weird tangents sometimes. But we appreciate you listening, and we are coming up on our 100th episode, so stay tuned. And as always, please leave a recommendation or a comment. It really helps on Apple and whatever other services that you use. We want to expand the community, and that's one of the best ways of doing that.
Yeah. So thank you in advance for doing that. We appreciate you leaving that review.
Thank you.